Okay, so let me be upfront about something before we dive in. This film just premiered on April 9th, and wide release is tomorrow, April 17th. I caught an early screening. I've been deep in the reactions, deep in the interviews, and what I want to do today is give you a real, honest, analytical breakdown of what Lee Cronin has built here and whether it actually delivers on what is, let's be real, one of the most loaded premises in modern horror. Because a new Mummy movie should not be exciting. That sentence should not make your pulse go up. And yet somehow, in 2026, here we are, and a lot of people who have seen this film are walking out looking like they've witnessed something that genuinely disturbed them. So let's talk about it. First, some context, because I think understanding what this film is not is just as important as understanding what it is. The Mummy as a franchise has been in an identity crisis for a long time. The Universal classic from 1932 with Boris Karloff is legitimately eerie, genuinely atmospheric, built on that slow, creeping dread that old Hollywood did so well. And then the Brendan Fraser films came along in 1999 and completely reinvented the IP as a globe-trotting adventure blockbuster. Indiana Jones with hieroglyphics and a bigger effects budget. Those movies are beloved. They're charming, they're fun, and they are absolutely not horror. And then in 2017, Universal tried to launch their dark universe with a Tom Cruise mummy that was, diplomatically speaking, a creative catastrophe that ended the whole concept before it even started. So walking into a new Mummy movie in 2026, the average person isn't exactly primed for terror. They're primed for skepticism. Lee Cronin understood this. And if the early reactions are anything to go by, his response was basically to look at all of that baggage and decide to build something so far from any of it that the name is almost the only thing they share. The premise here is deceptively simple. The young daughter of a journalist disappears into the desert without a trace, and 8 years later, she's returned to her broken family. What should be a joyful reunion becomes a living nightmare. That's it. That's where Cronin starts. And I think that setup is genuinely one of the smartest creative decisions in recent horror, because it doesn't lead with the monster. It leads with the family. It leads with loss and grief and the way 8 years of not knowing can hollow people out, and then it weaponizes all of that emotional context against you the moment things start to go wrong. This is the Hereditary playbook, and I mean that as a compliment. Ari Aster understood something that a lot of horror directors still underestimate. That the most effective horror is the kind that earns its scares by making you care first. The grief in Hereditary is real and raw before it becomes supernatural, and that investment is exactly why the film hits so hard. Cronin is clearly working from a similar emotional architecture here. The family isn't a vehicle for horror set pieces. The horror is happening to people we understand, which makes it hurt in a different way than it otherwise would. Early reactions from critics who caught the premiere screening are pretty consistent in what they're saying about the film's intensity. One critic described it as a freaky-as-fuck creep show that is scary, scream-worthy, and squirm-inducing, specifically calling out Natalie Grace's performance as the daughter Katie as the MVP of the film, a Linda Blair-inspired turn. That Linda Blair comparison is not throwaway. If Cronin is pulling from The Exorcist playbook for what a child's body can represent when it becomes the site of something ancient and wrong, that is a deeply considered creative choice. Because The Exorcist works on so many levels precisely because it frames demonic possession as a parent's worst nightmare. A child you know becoming something you don't recognize. A body that looks like your daughter doing things that your daughter would never do. It's not just scary. It's a violation of something sacred, and the best possession horror has always understood that. The film follows the young daughter of a journalist reappearing after 8 years as a living mummy, and the R rating tells you what you need to know about how graphic things get. Rated for gore, brief drug use, language, and strong violent content. Cronin is not softening this. He is not making a PG-13 horror experience for audiences who want to be mildly startled. He's making something genuinely confrontational. Now let's talk about what Cronin specifically brings to this, because his fingerprints are all over the DNA of how this film reportedly operates. Evil Dead Rise was not a perfect movie. I'll say that openly. But what it did brilliantly was build family horror with a tangible, physical, body-oriented dread that most studio horror doesn't have the stomach for. He understands how to use enclosed space. He understands how to make a monster feel intimate rather than distant, which is a crucial distinction. The monster in Evil Dead Rise wasn't scary because it was powerful. It was scary because it was someone's mother. The proximity, the familiarity, the wrongness of something beloved becoming something predatory. That is Cronin's specific skill set, and it maps onto this premise almost perfectly. Cronin has been open in interviews about pushing the gore to its absolute limits here, and skin removal is specifically described as an integral component of the plot, not just a shock tactic, but something woven into the story itself. And look, gore for gore's sake is a conversation I get tired of. If it's just splatter with no narrative purpose, it wears out its welcome fast. But mummification as a body horror concept, the drying, the wrapping, the removal, the preservation, has genuine thematic weight when applied to a child who went missing and came back changed. The question of what was done to her body during those 8 years, and what her body is now doing in return, is actually a rich horror premise if it's handled with intention. Based on what people are reporting from early screenings, it sounds like Cronin found that intention. One audience member specifically mentioned a scene involving nail clippers that apparently made them physically reset in their seat. I'm not going to explain that further. You're just going to have to experience that one for yourself. But the specificity of that reaction tells you something important. This film is not delivering generic horror. It's finding new, specific, particular ways to get under your skin, which is exactly what body horror needs to do to remain effective. Cronin himself has cited Poltergeist and Say 7 as influences on the story, and that combination is genuinely interesting to think about. Poltergeist is family under siege horror, domesticity disrupted by something ancient, parents rendered powerless in their own home, while their child is the focal point of the supernatural threat. Say 7 is about what you find at the end of an investigation being so much worse than anything you imagined along the way. Both of those films share a quality of dread that escalates toward revelation. And if Cronin is cooking with both of those, the film's structure makes a lot of sense. Let's get into some of the other elements that early conversation has highlighted, because this isn't just a one-note gore machine based on what critics are describing. Several reactions describe the film as taking a more demonic possession approach than most previous adaptations, which typically feature an ancient Egyptian ruler being resurrected to seek vengeance when their tomb is disturbed. That's a meaningful departure from formula, and it connects to why the Exorcist comparison keeps coming up. This is not a mummy waking up and going on a rampage. This is something ancient using a child's body as its vessel, which means the horror is intimate and domestic rather than epic and external. The terror is in the living room, not in the Egyptian desert. And that is so much scarier. The sound design and visual approach are things that several critics have flagged specifically. One critic noted a buffet of split diopter shots, which is that classic technique where two subjects at different distances are simultaneously in sharp focus, most famously associated with Brian De Palma, and the kind of controlled, deliberate stylization that signals a director who's thinking about every single frame. That's not a throwaway detail. That's Cronin announcing that this is a directed film, not just a horror product assembled for consumption. They're the visual language being constructed here, and the early word suggests it's a confident one. Jack Rayner plays Charlie Cannon, the journalist father, and Leia Costa plays Larissa, the mother. The cast also includes May Calamai and Veronica Falcon. And based on what people are saying, the performances across the board are holding their weight emotionally, which matters enormously for a film built on a family dynamic. You can have all the body horror in the world, but if the parents watching their daughter unravel don't feel real, the whole structure collapses. Now let's talk about the criticisms, because they're real and they're worth taking seriously. Not everyone is coming away fully satisfied. At least one critic found the film way too long, and at 2 hours and 13 minutes for a horror film, that's a legitimate concern worth flagging. Horror works best when it's tight, when it breathes, when it gives you room, when it doesn't outstay its welcome. The films that Cronin is clearly drawing from, Hereditary, The Exorcist, Evil Dead Rise, all operate with a sense of ruthless editing. Hereditary is 127 minutes and earns every one of them because every scene is doing emotional or structural work. If The Mummy is pushing 133 minutes and not filling all of that time with purpose, that's going to be felt. Point one, early response noted bizarre choices here, and they're alongside a generally positive experience, which is very Cronin. Evil Dead Rise had some tonal wobbles too, moments where the film lurched between registers in ways that worked for some viewers and jarred others. Cronin has a style that is genuinely distinctive, but that distinctiveness includes a certain roughness, a willingness to make choices that not everyone will be on board with. That is not always a weakness, but it means this film probably isn't going to be universally beloved. It's going to be a film that certain horror fans call a masterpiece, and others find excessive and overwrought. One reviewer who found the film effective also noted that it never quite crosses into something that burrows any further than the surface, and that critique stings a little because it points to something specific, the difference between a film that horrifies you in the moment and a film that stays with you afterward. The Exorcist stays with you. Hereditary stays with you. If The Mummy is delivering incredible in-theater intensity, but not the kind of psychological residue that makes a horror film genuinely great, that's a limitation worth naming. Being the most disturbing thing you've seen this year is impressive. Being the most disturbing thing you've thought about this year is something else entirely. The mystery payoff is another question mark. Lee Cronin's sightings say Seven as an influence sets a very high bar for what's at the end of the investigation, and say Seven's final reveal works because it recontextualizes the entire moral architecture of the film. If The Mummy's explanation for what happened to Katie during those 8 years doesn't land with equivalent force, all that buildup is going to feel frustrating rather than rewarding. Early reactions suggest the film's third act is where things escalate to their most extreme. At least one critic noted that the third act becomes especially intense. But intensity and satisfaction are different things. Here's where I land on all of this, and what genuinely excites me about this film beyond the spectacle of it. The Mummy as a horror concept is actually one of the richest in the genre's history, and it's been criminally underused as actual horror for most of the past 50 years. Ancient preservation, forced sleep, the violation of death itself, a civilization's entire funerary philosophy, their understanding of what the body means, what happens to consciousness after death, how the dead should be honored, weaponized against the living. That is extraordinarily fertile ground. The universal classic understood it. And it sounds like Lee Cronin, by anchoring all of that ancient horror in the body of a missing girl, by making it personal and domestic and parental, has found a way to make that mythology feel new. Cronin said at the time the film was announced that this will be unlike any mummy movie you ever laid eyeballs on before, promising to dig deep into the earth to raise something very ancient and very frightening. Based on the reactions pouring in, he wasn't performing modesty. The people who've seen her using language that suggests genuine discomfort, genuine fear, and genuine surprise at what Cronin actually built. Multiple critics who saw the premiere describe it as a dark, disturbing reboot with pure psychological horror, strong performances, eerie visuals, calling it a fresh and intense take on the genre. The production team alone tells you this film was given serious resources and serious intention. James Wan and Jason Blum producing together is an almost absurd concentration of horror expertise in one room. David Garbett as cinematographer from Evil Dead Rise means the visual language has continuity and confidence. Stephen McKeon composing again means the sound world has been built by someone who already knows how Cronin thinks about tension. These are not accidents. This is a filmmaker working with his team, building something deliberate. Is it perfect? Almost certainly not. At 2 hours and 13 minutes, with a tonal unpredictability that seems baked into Cronin's DNA, and with a mystery resolution that may or may not earn all the buildup, there are real question marks here. But the horror genre desperately needs filmmakers willing to go somewhere genuinely uncomfortable, willing to use the full weight of a concept rather than its commercial surface, willing to look at an iconic monster and ask what it would actually feel like if this was happening to your family. That is what the best horror does. and it sounds very much like Lee Cronin, once again, is doing it. Go see this film on the biggest screen you can find, in the darkest theater you can get to, ideally with someone whose arm you're allowed to grab. I'll be back with a full deep dive once the embargo lifts and we can really get into everything, including that third act, which I have some serious thoughts about. Until then, let me know in the comments what your expectations are going in, whether you're a Cronin fan already or this is your entry point. And if you've seen it, be vague in the spoilers because some people are watching this video to decide whether to go. And based on everything I've seen, I think you should.